Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to talk about circumcision, specifically Rabbi Sha'ul's teachings on circumcision. What does Paul have to say in his epistles about circumcision? And also we're going to look at what Genesis 17 says about circumcision and some of the commands in the Torah regarding that same issue. So we may have started to realize that the Torah matters. We're beginning to realize that Elohim still cares about his commandments, that the commandments are still good and right in his sight. And in realizing this, if we're coming to this through a Hebrew roots type movement or a Messianic Jewish movement, we might start to notice that some of the things in the New Testament also advocate for the Torah. And this may have been all along we've heard that that is absolutely not the case. We may have heard the opposite all of our lives. If we were raised in Christianity, we may have been told that the New Testament just did away with commands and that they don't matter anymore, and that that's what is being taught in the Gospels especially. But it's very obvious to us now that that's not exactly right. That many parts of the New Testament actually overtly support some of the commands. And so in realizing that, naturally, we might start to question some of the other teachings and traditions and traditional interpretations that we've heard. Some of these including, what does Paul teach? What does Rabbi Sha'ul teach? And of course, the common view is that Rabbi Sha'ul teaches against the Torah just totally. And since we know that's not exactly true when it comes to other sources, it's natural that we might question this. And so a lot of Messianic Jewish groups will go so far to say that Paul actually encourages following of the Torah. And some of them will say that he encourages circumcision. And even if we might be in one of these type of groups, there probably is a slight discomfort that still resides in us regarding Paul, regarding Rabbi Sha'ul. That no matter how many times that we've heard that, he's Rabbi Sha'ul, he's a Pharisee, he's a Torah teacher, that we still know there are some things that we don't exactly know how to interpret, that seem kind of questionable, some of the things that he has said. But at the same time, we may also know that he says some positive things about the Torah, that he says that the law is good, that he says that we do not make void the law, we establish the law instead. We've probably heard a lot of these passages over and over, but there still might be some question, some uncertainty regarding Paul. And so one approach that I've heard regarding this, and specifically regarding circumcision, is citing one of his passages like 1 Corinthians 7:19. This is actually something that I heard taught in a Messianic congregation I once attended. The circumcision is nothing, and the uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping of the commands of Elohim. So the way this might be viewed is, he must basically be sarcastic in this passage that he's just teaching like a rabbi, and we need to take it with that assumption in mind. He's saying that it's nothing, and then he goes on to say, but keeping of the commands of Elohim. And so someone's not going to be saying that the commands of Elohim are nothing, and it seems that he might be connecting it with the issue of circumcision. And so one might look at this verse in isolation and say, see, there's nothing to worry about, there's nothing to be uncomfortable about, that Paul is actually in favor of the commands. And so one of those commands being circumcision. One fundamental issue, though, that I think we need to be mindful about is the issue of context. And we can cite verses like these in isolation. And maybe we're approached by some Christian associates of ours or approached by others that believe Paul is against the Torah. and they're pointing out things that he says, and we might be kind of unsure how to respond, but we've heard these verses repeated, these verses like where he says the law is good, where he says we don't abolish the law. And so we say, well, I don't know about all of that, but here's one verse where he seems to say something positive about the law. The underlying issue that we need to address, though, is what is his overarching message? Obviously, just taking one single verse in isolation and saying that deals with any other issue on that point, obviously that's not taking it in context. Obviously, that's not an adequate response. And so we need to take what he's saying in context. We need to take it in the light of the rest of his teachings, both the immediately surrounding ones, which we're going to look at, and also what he says otherwise and what his followers are doing, his followers that he approves of. So we can look at the immediately preceding and immediately following verse where he says, anyone being called, having been circumcised, let him not be uncircumcised. So to explain that first part, this may seem kind of weird, but some people actually practiced this where they went on to stretch out what remained of the foreskin, so they basically became uncircumcised again. So Paul's saying, don't do that, that if you were called when you were circumcised, don't try to reverse it. But he also says, anyone being called in uncircumcision, let him not be circumcised. He says, anyone being called in uncircumcision, so someone that is not circumcised, and they have been called, let him not be circumcised. So Paul is saying, don't become uncircumcised, don't try to reverse it, and also don't become circumcised if you're not already. And he goes on to say, the circumcision is nothing, and the uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping of the commands of Elohim. So yes, he does say circumcision is nothing, but keeping of the commands of Elohim. But what about this other part? He also says, and the uncircumcision is nothing. We will come back to this momentarily. And in the next verse, it says, let every man remain in the calling to which he was called in this. So Paul already said at the beginning of this passage that the circumcised are not to become uncircumcised, and that the uncircumcised are not to become circumcised when they are called. And he closes off this passage by saying, let everyone remain in the calling to which he was called in this, basically reiterating what he said at the beginning. So this is not some secret Pharisaic teaching where he's actually advocating that people become circumcised. He is saying instead, let every man remain in the calling to which he was called in this. So it's true that we could look at that middle verse and just put our heads in the sand and say, well, what he's actually saying here is he's just being sarcastic, that he's not really meaning what he's saying, because they wouldn't say that circumcision is nothing, and he's just connecting it with the commands. But if we do that, we're ignoring what he is saying otherwise. We're ignoring the overarching message of this passage. So what is he saying in this middle verse, the first one that we looked at, where he says circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping of the commands of Elohim? So what is Sha'ul suggesting here if he's not suggesting the keeping of the commands of Elohim? Well, I would say he is suggesting the keeping of the commands of Elohim, but that he is defining them differently. He is not defining them in the same way that we might whenever we're drawing attention to the Torah. For he says the circumcision is nothing and the uncircumcision is nothing. This is an idea that's reiterated in some of his other teachings. Colossians 3:11, where there is not Greek and Jew, circumcision and uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, slave free, but the all in all anointed. So this is effectively a reiteration of what we already saw. We already saw that he said circumcision is nothing, and the uncircumcision is nothing. And here we have, he's saying it doesn't really matter. Effectively, he's saying that there is no such thing in the context of the anointed. There is no such thing as Greek or Jew. There is no such thing as circumcision or uncircumcision, just as he said that circumcision is nothing. And it is very clear, based upon how Paul describes his own followers, that his own followers did not believe in circumcision either. Galatians 2:3, but not even Titus, who was with me, being Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. In the context of Galatians 2, Paul is talking about these supposed false brethren that were brought in, that were advocating for circumcision, and he says that one of his followers, Titus, that he refers to elsewhere as his brother and also refers to him as his son, obviously a close follower of his who was with him at the time, says that he was not compelled to be circumcised. Not even Titus, who was with me, being Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So the fundamental assumption here is that he wasn't circumcised to begin with, and there was no intention in him becoming so. So people can say all they want that Paul is a Torah teacher and that he's just teaching in a way that we don't understand, but his close followers did not believe in being circumcised, and this is according to Paul himself. This is Paul describing one of his followers, and he is not suggesting it in a negative light at that. And it also says in Galatians 6:12, whoever wants to look good in flesh, these are compelling you to be circumcised, only that they shall not be persecuted for the stake of the anointed, or for the cross of the anointed. So what is the fundamental assumption in this statement? What is assumed to be true? It is assumed that Paul's congregation of the Galatians, that they were not circumcised, because otherwise there would be no point in mentioning that they were being compelled to be circumcised. And clearly it is talking about it in a literal sense, because it refers to looking good in the flesh. So we're talking about a literal cutting in this case. So we can't just look at a verse here and there and say, well, Paul says the law is good in this verse, so that must mean everything else he says should be disregarded. We have to understand what he's saying in its overarching context and the overarching result of it, even by his own explanation. What is the overarching message of Galatians? It's certainly not to be following the law and becoming circumcised. We can't just focus on an ambiguous passage here and there that seems like it might be favoring the Torah at the exclusion of his overarching message, at the exclusion of everything else he says. It's not just about whittling away at all of these problematic verses. It's an issue of what is his overarching message. Part of his overarching message in Galatians is the idea of two covenants. He says that there are two different covenants, and he makes this distinction. He refers to the covenant of bondage, and he refers to it as relating to the mountain which Elohim appeared in fire on, where the people heard the voice of Elohim. And he refers to this as the covenant which relates to Hagar, the covenant which is an issue of bondage. So clearly this is not an issue of the oral Torah. Clearly this is not an issue of rabbinic enactments, because he's talking about the mountain which the 10 words were received on, and the mountain which Moses later ascended to receive additional commands of the Torah. There wasn't a covenant of the oral Torah. And instead he tries to contrast that with the covenant of Abraham. So he says things like in Galatians 3:7, be knowing therefore that the ones from faith, these are sons of Abraham. So he goes into this big discussion regarding the seed of Abraham, and this just totally does not match up with what it says in Genesis. I go into this in much more detail in a video which you can check the link for in the description below if you haven't seen it yet. So he makes this connection with the Abrahamic covenant, the seed and the sons of Abraham. Let's look at what Genesis 17 says about the Abrahamic covenant and about the seed and about the sons of Abraham. Genesis 17, 10 through 11. This is my covenant, which you shall guard, between me and between you, and between your seed after you. Be circumcised to you all male. So it does not just say that this is a part of the covenant, it actually says, this is my covenant. Be circumcised to you all male. And it says this includes your seed after you. In the next verse, and you shall be circumcised, flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be to sign of covenant between me and between you. So there is no ambiguity here. It makes it very clear we're talking about the literal foreskin. We're talking about literal circumcision because it says the flesh. And this circumcision is to be a sign of the covenant. And it goes on in verse 14, and uncircumcised male, which flesh of his foreskin shall not be circumcised, and that vitality shall be cut from its peoples. He caused to annul my covenant. So it's interesting that Paul harkens back to the Abrahamic covenant, because the Abrahamic covenant states that the uncircumcised male is causing to annul his covenant if the flesh of his foreskin shall not be circumcised. And this doesn't just include those that are immediate descendants of Abraham. You can look elsewhere in Genesis 17, and it also specifies people that are being brought into his house that are not of his direct seed. We can see in Exodus 12:48 the commands in the Torah regarding the Passover, and that sojourner shall sojourn with you, and he shall do Passover to Yahuwah, all male to him being circumcised. And then he shall near to do it, and he shall be as native of the land. And all uncircumcised one shall not eat in it. So the sojourner is effectively going to be the Gentile that's dwelling among the Israelites, a Gentile of some sort. And he is choosing in this case to follow after Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, in order for him to participate in the Passover. And I might remind people that the Passover takes on a particular significance oftentimes in a lot of these messianic beliefs, including in some of the beliefs advocated by Paul. Part of the requirement of participating in the Passover is that all uncircumcised one shall not eat in it. The males must be circumcised in order to participate in the Passover. This is part of the command in the Torah regarding the Passover. And this includes the Gentiles that are seeking to join the congregation. And while we didn't look at this part specifically in Genesis 17, we also see in Leviticus 12:3, this is reiterated. And in the 8th day, flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. So the newborn male is commanded to be circumcised on the 8th day. This is included in Genesis 17, and it's also in Leviticus 12, as we see. So these are overt commands in the Torah. This is explicitly a part of the Torah, the issue of circumcision. And as we know, Deuteronomy 12:32 says, all of the word which I am commanding you, it you shall guard to do. You shall not cause to add on it, and you shall not diminish from it. We are commanded to do all of the Torah. We are commanded to guard all of the word which I am commanding you, to guard to do it. And we are not allowed to cause to add on it, and we are not allowed to diminish from it. In realizing that the commandments still matter today, in realizing that in wanting to love Elohim fully, in wanting to serve him according to how he has asked us, we are recognizing that Deuteronomy 12:28, for example, says that his Torah, his commandments, are what he considers good and right in his sight. And so we want to be doing what is good and right in his sight. Part of that is, just as we saw in Deuteronomy 12:32, that we are to guard to do all of his word, all of the commandment, and that we are not to add to it and not to take away from it. So with regard to the issue of Paul and Paul's teachings, there are some things that we might look to in Paul, some ambiguous passages, and say, well, this seems like it might be kind of favorable to the Torah. I mean, he says that they're not abolishing the Torah, and he says that the Torah is good. We might look to some verses like that and just try to kind of stick our head in the sand regarding the rest of it. And just think, well, I don't know about all the rest of that. I don't know exactly how to interpret it. And maybe we hear some ideas regarding that don't exactly sit completely well with us. Now, obviously, it's convinced some people, but we're seeing that, well, I don't know, that doesn't seem 100% right. And it can be easy to just try to accept what other people are accepting around us. It can be easy to kind of get into that and say, well, it doesn't seem exactly right, but these other people seem confident about it, and there are these enormous books that have been made to justify Paul as supposedly teaching the Torah, so I'll just accept that I don't really know and just go on with things. If we do that, we are allowing those teachings to seep in. Even if we still hold it as kind of like, not really sure, those teachings are still going to seep in, and they are going to affect how we view the Torah. They are going to cause us to add to the Torah and to take away from the Torah. That is going to cause us to violate those commands. And this is something we definitely don't want to be doing. If we are wanting to serve Elohim, serve him according to the way which is good and right in his sight, that is what we need to be learning about. All of this focus on Rabbi Sha'ul and trying to justify him as a Torah teacher, it is taking people away from the Torah. Because we need to be learning the Torah through what the commands actually say, through what it says in the Torah. This is how Moses advocated for the Torah to be taught. At the end of Deuteronomy, he said there is to be a reading of the Torah every 7 years, that the way the people are expected to learn the commands is through the teaching of the written Torah. So this is how we should be returning to his commands, returning to his ways. If we are realizing his ways are for all of the days as they are, and just as it says, this is what we need to be learning. So let us return to his ways. Let us seek after what he commanded. And let us reject these teachings that are not in line with it. These teachings that cause us to add to the law and take away from the law. That is a violation of what he considers good and right in his sight.